Assalamualaikum and welcome back to my video presentation on problem-based learning. The assessment and evaluation phase is both the end and the connecting point in problem-based learning. It is the end point for a learning cycle and a connecting point for the whole PBL process. A documented assessment process and result could be used to improve the next PBL process, including the problem design and the learning cycle. The assessment and evaluation process and procedures encompass within both the problem scenario design process and PBL learning cycle. In the problem scenario design process, the assessment process includes the process of assessing the relevancy of the real world problems that chosen for the student's learning, its relation with the content and the context of learning, and its connection with a student's previous knowledge and learning experience and skills. In the PBL learning cycle, the assessment process includes the process of assessing the student's learning. Both it's a sequential learning process, which is a formative assessment, and the product of learning, which is a summative assessment. This includes the students' learning skills of using higher order thinking skills during the diagnostic stage, their knowledge management skills during the self-directed learning stage, and their ability to apply meta-cognitive skills during the reflective learning stage. The assessment and evaluation process serves the overall evaluation of the PBL framework from the experimentation and piloting process up to the full-scale implementation of PBL. This enables the PBL cycle to maintain its double-loop learning. The learning design could be improved continuously through this cycle from time to time. In this presentation, I will be sharing three basic topics concerning the assessment and evaluation in PBL. One is introduction to assessment and evaluation in PBL. Two is the goals of assessment in PBL. And three, how to design an effective assessment tool for PBL. Problem-based learning is not only frequently a culture shock to new students faced with its alien paradigm, but also to educators who try to use this technique in their teaching. Besides the fundamental challenge of creating a good problem, educators are faced with the task of deciding how to evaluate the technique's effectiveness and how to assess whether students have met the overall learning outcomes for the course. The traditional assessment techniques such as the familiar multiple choice and true-false examination do little to truly assess a student's understanding and for transfer of the PBL learning experience. Likewise, evaluating the success of PBL as compared to more traditional lecture-based classes requires more complex techniques. PBL's student-centered focus and emphasis on self-directed learning create unique challenges for the development of an effective assessment technique. In Barrow's Medical School's assessment model, assessment occurs in the context of an individual PBL problem to be solved by the students. While this method is most true to the PBL model, it is manpower intensive and not scalable to large classes with only one or two instructors. On the other hand, traditional assessment in the form of objective tests scale well to large students population but are not true to the PBL model. In the field of assessment, then we seek to answer the question, is there a technique between the Barrow's model and traditional assessment that can meet the needs of PBL and still be scalable to large class size? Student assessment seeks to provide a diagnostic tool to ensure students are progressing adequately towards achieving the desired learning outcomes. Assessment should not be solely a grade assignment or ranking tool. All too often, the learning process degenerates for students into striving to do well on the test so they will have a good grade rather than focusing on the learning goals of the course. Generally, there are three guiding principles to assessment. One, content. Assessment reflects what is most important for students to learn. Two, learning. Assessment enhances learning and supports instructional practice. And three, equity. Assessment supports every student's opportunity to learn. Assessment methods that are adaptable to PBL, which itself adapts to diverse learning styles, should adapt to the needs of a diverse student population. PBL seeks to incorporate a multidisciplinary approach in the solution of problem. Students are given a problem but not constrained on where they may look for answer. All too often, traditional assessment tools focus on isolated facts and techniques to the detriment of students' understanding of the larger integrated concepts involved. Narrow assessments allow students to pass through the system on rote memorization rather than through understanding. The concept principle emphasizes that assessment should never be trivialized for the convenience of assessment, but rather should emphasize problem solving, thinking, and reasoning skills. The learning principle emphasizes that assessment should continue the learning process and not be viewed as a disjoint activity. Too often, there is a complete break of learning activities in the traditional approach where teaching ends and then there is an assessment. It will encourage students to get by on their memorization skills and continue their passive participation in the educational process. This is the type of assessment of learning, the summative assessment, the principal foundation of the traditional assessment method. PBL assessment should be focusing more on the principle of assessment as learning and maintain the principle of assessment for learning, which is the formative assessment. Assessment as learning is the use of ongoing self-assessment by students in order to monitor their own learning, which is characterized by students reflecting on their own learning and making adjustments so that they achieve a deeper understanding. Through this process, students are able to learn about themselves as learners and become aware of how they learn and become metacognitive, which is knowledge of one's own thought processes. Assessment for learning emphasizes the shift from summative to formative assessment. It happens during the learning, often more than once rather than at the end. Students understand exactly what they are to learn, what is expected of them, and are given feedback and advice on how to improve their work. In assessment for learning, teachers use assessment as an investigable tool to find out as much as they can about what their students know and can do, and what confusions, preconception, or gaps they might have. Whatever assessment technique is used, it must be viewed by student as an active part of the learning process, not some ancillary activity. The idealistic goal of the learning principle is to make it indistinguishable to an observer as to whether instruction or assessment is occurring in the classroom. This principle certainly lay out laudable goals, but are there other principles that could be potentially applied to the PBL assessment process? In general, the assessment should one provide for authentic tasks, two provide data that are repeatable, three provide students with the opportunity to evaluate and reflect on their own understanding, and four provide a means of reporting on students' progress. One, provide for authentic tasks. Clearly, providing authentic tasks is in assessment should be a key principle of any PBL assessment. An authentic task is one which is similar to a task performed in real life. The uses and advantages of authentic tasks are discussed in situated learning. If providing an authentic task as part of a good problem statement is a key to maximizing students' learning during a PBL experience, Why wouldn't it be key to the assessment experience also? If we want to blur the line between instruction and assessment, then one obvious solution would be to make the assessment be fairly similar to the instructional technique. Authentic tasks alone are not the answer. There must be a close relationship between the assessment task and the desired learning outcomes of the class. Authenticity alone is not sufficient to ensure an adequate assessment. Two, provide data that are repeatable. Whatever assessment technique is used, the result should be repeatable. This is an obvious goal, but the solution is not so obvious or easily attained. Other than some traditional trivial assessment techniques like multiple choice question, most assessment tools, especially those related to PBL, are fairly subjective. This makes it a challenge to create assessments where the results are repeatable over time. 3. Provide students with the opportunity to evaluate and reflect on their own understanding. Given students the opportunity to evaluate and reflect on their own learning is a key element in PBL. The self-assessment phase of a PBL session allows the facilitator to help students with assessing their own performance in solving a problem. Self-assessment in PBL allows the students to compare their performance with the goals which they set for themselves before the problem started. It allows them to develop the skills to monitor their own learning outside the academic environment and helps them to move towards the elusive goal of becoming lifelong learners. The ability of a PBL to foster reflection in students is largely a function of the facilitator's ability to introduce opportunities for reflection into the PBL experience. If the facilitator fails to properly probe and question a student's conclusion, he does not foster an atmosphere where reflection can take place. An adequate assessment tool can help to overcome the deficiencies of any particular facilitator in fostering reflection. Four, provide a means of reporting on a student's progress. Whether or not we consider grades as important, the requirement to report on a student's progress will be around for quite some time. An effective assessment tool must also provide the ability to report on student progress in a fair and objective manner. 3. How to design an effective assessment tool for PBL. Given the list of principles in assessment as we discussed just now, how do we then use them to design an effective assessment tool? There are two most important steps. Step one is to have a clear understanding of what the learning outcomes are for the course. This sounds trivial, but it often requires some talks to translate high-level learning goals that might be published for a course into specific measurable knowledge elements that represent the key concepts we want a student to leave the course with. Fortunately, with PBL, much of this work has already been accomplished since the same process is used in problem design. There are two options for this first step. Option one would be to prepare objective questions that test the student's comprehension of the task identified in the step above. The advantage of this is that it is fairly easy to do and even easier to score. On the other hand, it violates some of our previously outlined principles. First, it sacrifices depth for ease of scoring. Secondly, and probably most importantly, it violates the very principle we espouse if we believe in PBL as a learning technique. We ask the students to conduct problem solving through analysis of the facts, refinement of hypotheses, and examination of learning issues as a way to effectively solve ill-structured problems. And then, during assessment, we ask a fragmented question in a traditional manner. Students are often puzzled and feel betrayed by an apparent shift in instructor techniques. Option 2. The second option should sound familiar for any PBL practitioner. create a problem statement, the solution of which requires the students to demonstrate the desired depth of understanding of the learning outcomes. The problem can be similar to the ones used in class, which would assess a near transfer, or they could be apparently very different on the surface, which would assess a far transfer. Of course, to be feasible for large group PBL, the solution needs to be achievable within the assessment time available. This creates a challenge for the problem designer that is potentially even more difficult than the design of a normal PBL problem. Step two, the second step is to plan and design the assessment procedure for two levels of learning, the process of learning and the product of learning. Both represent the formative and summative assessment of the learning. PBL assessment models are rarely discussed in this current exam-oriented educational system. Some may consider it an extreme approach and could be detrimental to the existing assessment practice. The fact of the matter is that PBL assessment model had already been practiced ever since its first inception in the 1960s. In the next video presentation, I will be sharing two PBL assessment models practiced in medical and engineering education. Till then, thank you very much for your time and kind attention to my presentation. Please subscribe to my channel and don't forget to like and share this video. If you have something to share, please leave the comment below. Have a great day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.